sure you've heard of it. You take your car to a dyno shop and some nerd with a laptop sits in the driver's seat, pushes buttons, and then supposedly your car will run better and not blow up. But what is tuning? How does it work, and how do you know if you need a tune? Now, this video aims to answer those questions and more. A tuning is often treated like black magic, and the answer to the question, do I need a tune, is blindly responded to with yes, which seems mighty convenient for the guy you're paying to tune your car. Now, I'm gonna pause here and give you the quick answer to the question, do I need a tune? The answer is probably yes. Case closed, stop the video, we're done here. But you can't help but wonder, I only put a bigger intake on my car. Do I really need a tune just for that? And honestly, yeah, you probably do. But do you need a 3-hour tuning session on a dyno that'll set you back $600 redos? No, you don't. Tuning as a whole is a very complicated topic. There are many rabbit holes to delve into, but that's one of the reasons it's my favorite part of building cars. This video aims to demystify tuning a bit. Now, hopefully by the end, you'll have a better idea of how tuning works and be able to answer an even better question. Why do I need a tune? Now, first things first, let's address exactly what a tune is. Tuning is a term that broadly covers many different topics with regards to an ECU. Now, your typical modern ECU, or engine control unit, is responsible for controlling many different functions of your engine. It is, after all, the main computer that's running your engine. Fueling, ignition timing, idle, boost pressure, these are all examples of functions that an average ECU is controlling. And thus, your ECU will have pre-programmed calibrations, or maps, for all these functions. So, for example, if you were to install larger injectors, you'd need to update some fueling calibrations. If you install a different turbo, you're going to need to tune your boost control calibrations. Now, in this video, we're going to be taking a look at one slice of tuning, with the goal being that you get a better idea on how your ECU works and why tuning matters. All right, with that out of the way, let's get moving. The part of ECU tuning we're going to be looking at is fuel tuning, or how the ECU knows how much fuel to give your engine. To do that, we're going to start by going back to the basics of how engines work. Let me ask you a question. What does your engine run on? For those of you who answered fuel, you're half correct. The true answer is air and fuel, with a key focus on air. The ratio of air and fuel getting injected into each cylinder is incredibly important. Let me give you an example. This is a sealed glass container. We're going to use it to represent a single cylinder of our engine. Our cylinder is full of 100% air right now, so all we need to do is add fuel. We'll use this paper towel as our fuel. What I'm going to do is light the fuel in our fully enclosed container to simulate an ignition event in our engine. Here we go. Look at that. Not all the fuel burned. Why is that? Well, that's because there simply isn't enough air in the container to allow our fuel to completely burn. Any combustion, be it in an engine, in a campfire, or even in this cylinder, requires air to completely burn. During this combustion, eventually all the air was consumed by the flame. Now, there's still plenty of fuel left in here, but that doesn't matter because it's not just about how much fuel you have. You also need the proper amount of air. So in this jar, the air to fuel ratio was completely out of whack. We didn't have enough air. Or maybe we had too much fuel, depending on how you look at it. Now, having too much fuel is what's known as a rich condition, as in we're rich with fuel. So what would happen if I were to instead put this tiny amount of fuel in? Let's find out. Well, it all burns, of course. That wasn't very much fuel at all, was it? Because there wasn't so much fuel, we can make a guess that there's probably still a good amount of air left in this cylinder, which means we're actually in a lean condition, meaning we have a lot of air and not enough fuel. Again, that air to fuel ratio is completely out of whack. This time we had too much air, or not enough fuel. So what does all this mean? There must be an ideal amount of air and fuel we can combine so that when it ignites, we consume all the air and all the fuel, leaving nothing behind. Now, this magic ratio of air and fuel is called a stoichiometric ratio, or just being stoic. We wouldn't be too lean, We wouldn't be too rich, we would just be stoic. Now, I've done some trial and error and found that about this much fuel and this much air is the magic ratio for this example. Let's go ahead and light it and see what happens. And there we go, a perfect burn. No air left behind and no fuel left behind. All right, so how does that example relate back to engines? Now, obviously there is an ideal or a stoic air to gasoline fuel ratio that exists, just like our paper towel example. The stoic air to gasoline fuel ratio is 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel. And maintaining that 14.7 to 1 ratio is very important in a gasoline engine, and I'll explain why in a bit. Now, in a gasoline engine, you have very little control over the air going into the cylinders. Sure, we have the throttle plate, but that's just not precise enough to control the amount of air actually entering the cylinders. Since our goal is to control the ratio of air to fuel entering the cylinder, and since we can't accurately control the air factor, our only other option is to control the fuel. Enter the humble fuel injector. Now, fuel injectors are pretty simple. Up here we have pressurized fuel ready to enter the cylinder, and down here we have the entrance to the cylinder. When 12 volt is applied to these pins, the injector opens and sprays the fuel out. So really, it's just a valve above each cylinder that controls the fuel. Now, these valves are on-off. There's no in-between. They're either open or they're closed. So if we have a small amount of air entering the cylinder, like maybe your throttle is closed and you're just sitting there idling, we can open the injector for a very short period of time to let just a little bit of fuel into the cylinder. If there's a lot of air entering the cylinder, like maybe you're doing a $110 down the interstate, you can open the injector for longer to let more fuel into the cylinder. Now, the example I'm giving here is over-exaggerated. Here's how fast the injectors are normally operating. As you can see, the amount of fuel injected into the cylinder needs to be very tightly coupled to the amount of air inhaled. Now, here's a fun little fact. If you want more power out of your engine, you're obviously going to want a bigger bang in the cylinder. We already know that in order to add more fuel to get that bigger bang, you need an appropriate amount of air too. So really, if you want more power, you actually want more air going into your engine. Hence the existence of superchargers and turbochargers. All they do is just force more air into the cylinders, and you can add more fuel to get that bigger bang. Think of every mod you can do to your engine. It's probably changing how much air is going into or out of the engine in some way. But with that additional air, we must inject additional fuel. Okay, so now we've got a good idea on not only what an air-to-fuel ratio is, but also how the ECU can change it using the fuel injectors. Let's take a look at a real-world example. Now, this is my 2005 WRX. It's my daily, and it has an air-to-fuel ratio sensor installed, also known as an O2 sensor. This special sensor analyzes the exhaust coming out of the engine and is able to determine what ratio of air to fuel going into the running engine is. Now, idling right now, things sound fine, and indeed, if we use the sensor to inspect the AFR, we can see that it's running right around that magic 14.7 stoichiometric number. Turns out, O2 sensors do more than just cause check engine lights. Who would have guessed? Now, what I'm going to do is cause the injectors to stay open for longer. The amount of air going into the engine is going to stay the same, of course, but the amount of fuel going in should increase. This should, in theory, make the mixture richer. All right, here we go. Okay, so the injectors are opening for just a bit longer now, and that AFR number has gone down. Now, why did the number go down? Remember, this is an air-to-fuel ratio number, as in how many airs are there per fuel. Since we added more fuel, there's now technically less airs per fuel, thus the number went down. It is a ratio, after all. Now, that doesn't mean there's less air entering the cylinder. Again, that hasn't changed much. There's still the same amount of air coming in. But we've increased the amount of fuel going in, meaning the ratio has dropped. One thing though, it still sounds like it's running fine despite there being too much fuel going into the cylinders. Let's add some more and see what happens. Oh boy. She doesn't like that. Let's add some more. And there it is. We've added so much fuel that the engine can no longer run, and it is stalled out. We were so rich that it just couldn't keep going. I'm gonna fire it back up now. So as you can see, we had to richen things up quite a bit before the engine actually started to act up. Now, what happens if we go in the other direction? What if we close the injectors too early and make the mixture lean? Let's find out. Okay, we're pretty lean right now, but it is still running. Let's go ahead and lean it out more. Oh, there we go. The engine stalled out now because it didn't have enough fuel to continue running. Okay, so why does all this matter? The engine was still running relatively fine despite us being pretty rich or pretty lean. The only time it really had issues is when we took things to the extreme. Is that all there is to this? No, of course not. So what do we learn from this example? You cannot rely on the sound or the feeling of the engine to determine if you need a tune. We brought the car both rich and lean, and it still sounded like it was idling pretty fine. It felt all right too. Other than some extra exhaust fumes on a cold day, it really only started to show signs of trouble when we took things to the extreme, when we were too far gone. The only source of truth is, in fact, the data. Now, running rich or lean both have negative impacts on the engine. When running rich, the exhaust may become dirtier, as we saw. You'll notice a lack of power, and the spark plugs, the exhaust, and the pistons tend to get sooty over time, and the catalytic converter may become clogged. Now, if we run real rich for an extended period of time, liquid fuel can actually make it past the piston rings and wash the oil off of the cylinder walls, thus increasing wear. That fuel can also make it into the oil, diluting it and reducing its lubricity. All of that can lead to a total engine failure. Running lean, on the other hand, causes the combustion event to become much hotter, thus increasing stress on the internal components of your engine. It also causes less power to be made, but perhaps most importantly, it can lead to detonation. Detonation, or det, sometimes called knock, is an abnormal combustion event that is very damaging to the engine. Not to be confused with rod knock, that's something completely different, though this kind of knock can actually lead to rod knock in the end, funnily enough. Det is probably one of the #1 killers of an engine, so it's important that we don't run the engine lean. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I'd suggest you watch this video for more info. So, knowing what we just learned, we must always want to keep the engine running at that 14.7 ratio all the time, right? It is, after all, the ideal stoichiometric ratio. Not exactly. When you're just idling or cruising around, yeah, 14.7 is probably where you want to be. But when you're under power, i.e. wide open throttle, you actually want things to be a bit rich. Making things a bit richer actually helps cool down the combustion, which keeps the engine running cooler and lets you not only make more power, but keep your engine safe. In fact, your ECU is programmed with what's called a target AFR. When you nail it, the programmed target AFR tends to dip richer, which the ECU uses to open the injectors for a bit longer. If you want to learn more, here's a video that goes a bit more into depth on the subject. Now, in summary, we never want to run lean. Running lean is what can truly kill an engine. Now, running rich isn't as detrimental, and in some cases, we actually want to run rich, but not always. If we had to choose between rich or lean, we'd probably want to run rich, but ideally, we'd be exactly where we're supposed to be at all times, that target AFR I mentioned. In fact, when you're tuning a car, your goal is to match your current AFR with the target AFR. Okay, let's get back on track. We now know the amount of fuel going into the cylinders is of the utmost importance. So how does the ECU actually calculate the amount of fuel to inject into the cylinders? First things first, we need to make sure the ECU knows the size of our injectors so he knows how much fuel he's actually injecting when he opens the injectors. Remember, injectors are only on-off, so how much fuel an injector injects in a given time period is very important for the ECU to know. You've probably seen a bunch of different injector sizes out there if you've ever gone shopping with them. Things like 460 or 565, 1050. But your ECU is probably already programmed with the size of the injectors that came with your engine. Now when you buy aftermarket injectors, they usually come with a datasheet that you can use to program your ECU so he knows their size. So yeah, that means if you put bigger injectors in your car, you need a tune. I can't count the number of times I've seen people install bigger injectors in their car and not get a tune. Get a tune. Cool. So that solves the fuel part of our air-to-fuel ratio. Now we just need to solve the air part. So that begs the question, how does the ECU know how much air is going into the engine? He needs to know that to calculate how long to open the injectors for to achieve the proper ratio. So he's got to be able to measure the air going into the engine. Now there are two common ways for the ECU to measure or meter the amount of air going into the engine. A mass airflow sensor, or a MAF sensor, or a manifold absolute pressure sensor, or the MAP sensor. MAF and MAP. Now, both are good ways of metering the air going into the engine. However, the MAF is easier to understand, so that's what I'm going to focus on for this video. Now, mass airflow sensors are very simple. They tell you how much air is flowing past them using a 0 to 5 volt signal. That's it. Okay, so you can hear that the car is idling away, happy as can be. What if I were to remove the mass airflow sensor from the intake air stream? Let's find out. Well, of course it's going to stall. How else would the ECU know how much air is going into the engine so he knows how much fuel to put in? Simple. So a low voltage, like 1 volt, means there isn't a whole lot of air flowing past the sensor. Maybe you're idling or something. Now, a larger voltage, like maybe 4.5, probably means you're wide open throttle and giving her all she's got. But here's the thing. That's just a voltage. It means nothing. How am I supposed to know how many grams of air there are going into an engine just from a voltage of 1.69? That doesn't help me at all. Remember, we are literally measuring a very precise amount of fuel to inject into the engine by opening the injector for a very precise amount of time. We need a precise measurement of air to do that. So we got to convert or calibrate or scale that raw voltage into a real measurement of air so we can inject the proper amount of fuel. The way most ECUs work is by converting the voltage into grams of air per second. Thus, we should be able to calculate the grams of fuel per second to inject into the cylinders. Now this is my ECU's MAF calibration. You can see that we have voltage and grams of air per second, so the ECU can just look up the voltage and see how many grams of air are flowing into the engine. It's pretty simple. And there's a bunch of data points here to help us finally calibrate what voltage equals what airflow, which is good because it's not actually linear, as you can see from the little chart below. So, now the ECU knows how much air is going into the engine. He also knows how big the injectors are, so he can combine those two factors to calculate how long to open the injectors to achieve his target air-fuel ratio. Easy. You now have a handle on how the ECU knows how much fuel to inject. Essentially, he measures the air going into the engine and injects the proper amount of fuel for that measured airflow. So, how can you use this knowledge to know if you need a tune? Let's take a look at another example. One of the most common mods people do to their cars is installing a new intake on it. We'll use this as an example. Now, here is the WRX's baseline. You can see that it's idling away, happy as can be. Let's go ahead and install our larger intake and see what happens. We'll install this short ram intake that also has a larger diameter. Now this takes it from a 65mm intake to an 83mm intake in the process. Because bigger is always better. Right? Uh-oh, now the engine sounds like shit. What's going on? Now, you might be tempted to think that this new intake messed with the idle somehow, but that's not the case. The engine's actually running lean. So lean, in fact, that it's operating outside the sensor's range. That's not good, but why did this happen? Remember, the mass airflow sensor only measures air going past it. The same amount of air is still flowing into the engine, but we've increased the diameter of the intake, and thus less air is actually flowing past the sensor. The sensor is reading lower airflow than it should be, so the ECU is going to inject less fuel. You've changed a characteristic of airflow and you didn't tell the ECU, or we're way off our target AFR now. It's not magic. The ECU only knows what his sensors tell him and what his calibrations say, and now his calibration is wrong. So, what if we want to keep this intake? How can we solve this lean issue? Well, that's by tuning the ECU, of course. This is where we draw the line. This is where we step in and say, it's time for a tune. But that doesn't necessarily mean going to the dyno. There's plenty of cheaper ways to get a working tune. In some cases, you can get an off-the-shelf tune that comes with the intake. Or maybe you could buy an e-tune that somebody made that matches your setup. Me, however, I just tune it myself. Now that's a topic that won't fit into this video, but know that these are things you can do on your own with the proper tools and a little bit of knowledge. So, let's finally answer the question. How do you know if you need a tune? If you've changed the airflow of your engine in any way, you should probably get a tune. But more importantly, why do you need a tune? Because you've changed the characteristics of airflow and you need to recalibrate the ECU for those changes. Now, what if you don't get a tune and leave it as is? Best case scenario, you're leaving some power on the table that you could obtain if you got a tune. And there's also a chance that the car won't run too great as well. Worst case scenario, you could harm your engine. And this isn't just about intakes either. Let's say you put a better flowing exhaust on the car. That means that there will be less exhaust left over in the cylinder when we go to inhale more engine on the next revolution, so we actually got more air into the cylinder, meaning more power. Yay! But you need to tell the ECU so that he can add more fuel for that additional air. Boo! And the same thing with other mods like new cams, ported intake or head, a bigger turbo. The ECU needs to be recalibrated for these changes. Also, if you've changed fueling in any way, you'll need a tune. Remember, your ECU is programmed with the size of the injectors that are currently installed. If you put bigger ones in or change your fuel pressure, you need to tell your ECU. He doesn't magically know. Now, one question I hear a lot is, can't the ECU just learn this stuff? And the answer is no. And also yes, but mostly no. To put it succinctly, ECU learning should only be considered useful at either idle or cruise conditions, i.e. not when you're wide open throttle, which is probably when you need to tune the most. Now why is this? Well, because idle and cruise are where you spend most of your time. Thus, we want to make sure we're not wasting fuel under those conditions. When you are under power, such as at wide open throttle, you're usually not under power for very long. And even when you are, you're moving through the rev range so fast that the ECU doesn't really have time to learn and compensate for any discrepancies in the AFR. Most factory ECUs disable learning when you're under power and rely entirely on their calibrations for these reasons. ECU learning is also typically limited to somewhere between 15% and 25%. It's just not designed to compensate for engine mods. It's designed to increase fuel economy. Now, there's one glaring issue with this video. All I've talked about thus far is tuning your fuel, and that's only part of the puzzle. One other very important part of tuning is ignition timing, which I've intentionally not covered in this video. The question I was really trying to help you answer is, why do I need a tune? And with the information I've provided, I believe you can now answer that question for yourself. The target audience for this video is people doing simpler mods, like intakes and exhausts. If you're doing more intense things like a bigger turbo or cams, you're going to need to tune more than just your AFRs. Things like ignition timing, idle, and injectors are likely going to need to be tuned in order for the car to run properly and safely. So, go get a tune. Alright, I think that's about everything I wanted to tell you. If you're into this kind of video, be sure to subscribe. Also, consider checking out some of my other videos, like how I Honda K-swapped my Subaru or LS swapped my RX-8. But until then, bye for now.